He said, this one shall not be your heir, but one from your own body shall be your heir. All right, so he said, okay, that's not how it's going to happen, but it didn't happen. So Sarah said, look, Abraham, God said it's going to come from your body, but he didn't specifically say my body. So at first he didn't. And so she said, I've got a plan. In Genesis 16, now Sarai, her name hadn't been changed yet, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. How did that happen? You got to jump back to Genesis chapter 12. There's a famine. And Abraham goes down to Egypt during the famine because there's no food in Canaan. And he's a little worried that even though she's 60, 65 years old, Sarah is drop dead beautiful, as they say. And keep in mind, they lived a lot longer then. They retained their resilience and their beauty longer, I'm assuming. I'm assuming that if you live to 175, that you don't start looking 75 when you're 75. That you look better longer. And so even though she had technically gone through menopause, because she said the time of bearing is past, she was still very beautiful. And Abraham was afraid that maybe she had, these beautiful sky blue eyes or just something very striking and unusual. And some of the commentators I've read said the people living in Egypt then were a little more swarthy, and she stood out as someone who would be a real prize in a harem. So Abraham was, he must have known it too, because he was afraid. And he says to Sarah, look, I know you're a beautiful woman. And when we go to Egypt, they're going to see you. And they're not as civilized as some places. They're going to kill me and take you. So do me a favor. You are my half-sister. Let's forget the husband-wife part. Just mention the sister-brother part when we go down. He said, it's not a total lie. It's just 50% true, which means the other 50% is what? A lie. Yeah, wouldn't you have a different relationship between your wife and your sister, we hope? So it's not communicating the truth. So they go down there, and Pharaoh, sure enough, the people in Pharaoh's house said, wow, have you seen that guy's wife? He takes her into his harem, but he hasn't known her yet. And all these plagues fall on his house. And finally, the Lord says, don't touch that man's wife. That's his wife. And Pharaoh said, she should have veiled herself. Take her out of the land. And he gives Abraham all these rewards. He says, look, I know God's with you, so I'm going to give you these things. And among the things he gives him, it says, you read in Genesis 12, 15 through 16, the princes of Pharaoh saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house, and he treated Abraham well for her sake. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Notice where it says female servants. Somewhere along the way, Pharaoh gave Abraham female servants. Later, we hear about a servant named Hagar who was an Egyptian. That's probably where she was acquired. He didn't bring her from Mesopotamia, where he had come from. Now you go to Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. She's young, she's vibrant, she's healthy. So Sarah says to Abram, see now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. He said he's going to have children through your own body, but maybe not through my body. At least not yet. She hadn't heard that. Please go into my maid. Back then they didn't use the test tube. They did it the old-fashioned way. But she was going to be a surrogate. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Now, this wasn't the only time that happened. Who else went for the surrogate idea? Jacob's wives, when they stopped bearing, they attempted to have children through their handmaids and did the same thing. So this is not unheard of back then. Rather than adopt, they said, well, at least the child will be 50%. No, you could adopt, but they said at least the child will be 50% because it'll be half of the husband's and maybe not the wife's, but that was how they dealt with it back then. Then Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife. And after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, now he's 85, nothing's happened, no children yet. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Now, you got to face it, if she is the servant girl of Sarah, and she says, yes, ma'am, and she's doing whatever Sarah says, and I'm sure at first Sarah was very kind to her, but now she has been intimate with Sarah's husband. She's pregnant. She's going to have the baby. She probably begins to strut around and show off her tummy. And Sarah still orders her around as in the good old days. But Hagar says, wait a second. I'm not just a slave. I'm a wife. Did you notice that word there? It says to be his wife. He gave her to her husband to be his wife. Her status has changed, but Sarah's still treating her like a servant. Now, so Hagar, you can understand, she became despised in her eyes. So there was a tension that develops here at this point. Abraham has Ishmael. God says to Abraham, he is not the one. And you go to Genesis 17:19. Then God says, no, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you will call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I will bless him, and I will make him fruitful, and I'll multiply him exceedingly. He will beget 12 princes.